Dude, if I had 300 grand, I would 100%. So when people usually think of the kind of cars I buy, whether it's a Lambo that's been a little bit on fire, or a Ferrari that's been a lot on fire, or a Bentley that's spent most of its life in Russia and now has an engine that works half as well as it did, I have a standard that I abide by when I buy these broken cars as projects. Ed Bolian called me and he asked me if I wanted to take on another project, which was the Bugatti Veyron that went into the Galveston Bay. And I was pretty excited, even though this was way above my pay grade. Now, this was an interesting story for sure. So for anybody that isn't familiar with this, this was the viral video that happened quite a while ago. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago. And this was the Veyron that was, well, he was speeding down the highway and then he went straight into the water, seemingly for no reason at all. Now, the problem was he told the insurance that a seagull had gone by his car and then he had to swerve to avoid it and he went into the water. Lo and behold, it was an insurance scam and he wanted to get rid of the car. So he actually had the engine running. He went into the bay and he wanted to just kill the car, get the insurance money. Now, Ed's done a really good job with that video and all the details there, but I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory of what I thought of this project and how to put a Veyron back together when it's in a million pieces and it's also been flood damaged. When you take on a project like this, it's not something that you should really take lightly because one, they haven't really made too many Veyrons, and two, there's not a forum that you can go to. There's not a Veyron Owners Association that you can say, hey, how do you put these cars back together? That's not a thing that happens. So when Ed came to me and he said, is this even possible? I said, yeah, of course, anything is possible. However, there's a lot of issues that come with it. So the car was in a 3,500 square foot warehouse and it was in a million pieces. So the entire car was taken apart. And what Ed showed me as far as pictures was that it was just a bare shell. All the components were off of it. And we had to basically track down all of the parts. And there was some discrepancies of who owned what parts. So that was sketchy in itself. But I thought if we can get all the parts together, then perhaps we can make a car. And the parts that were broken shouldn't have been that big of a deal. Now, the radiators, those usually are made of steel. Those don't last very long in salt water, so those had to be replaced. Now, you can make radiators custom, and it's not a big deal to do that. There are 10 or 12 of them in that car, so it's the cost adds up over time, but it's not that big. I mean, it is a Veyron after all. Another thing is we knew that Bugatti wasn't going to cover any of this. They weren't going to allow us to buy parts for the car. That's just not something you do. But in order to make it a DIY thing, what you have to do is you kind of have to reverse engineer the entire thing. You have to make a wiring diagram from scratch. Usually you'd have to get a factory service manual or something from the manufacturer. That wasn't available. So with the Veyron, you'd have to basically trace back everything. You'd have to look up part numbers because they are Volkswagen and Audi part numbers, which is a good thing. You can get pinouts for that, but it's going to require months and months of work. Now, the big thing that I was really concerned about was the engine and gearbox. And those, if that goes, then basically the entire project is scrapped. The car was for sale for 300 grand and with all the parts, but we didn't know what all the parts were. So for 300 grand, if you had all the parts and you did some custom work, you could probably get away with it for under 500 grand, which for a Veyron, for a running, driving Veyron, wouldn't be bad. So what a lot of people don't understand is that there are echelons to exotic cars. You have your regular kind of Lexus and Infiniti, which have more expensive parts than a Honda Civic. Then you have a Ferrari or Lamborghini, which have parts that you could get at a dealer, but you're going to be spending 10 or 20 grand. Let's say if something goes really, really wrong. 50 grand on the highest, like an engine blows up, you're spending 50 grand. A Veyron, a little bit different in that respect. If something goes wrong on a Veyron, you're spending $250,000. And that's a margin of error that was insurmountable. Neither of us had the money to do anything like that. 300 grand is more money than both Ed and I have, but Ed had the connections. He had the financing that he could potentially do it. And I was, I guess, crazy enough to try to take on that project. And I did just get a 5,000 square foot shop, so space was not really a concern. I had the tools for it. And if need be, we could just kind of leave it gathering dust for as long as we needed until we get the right parts. So that wasn't really an issue. The big issue came with the fact that there were a lot of really big unknowns. And the unknowns came in the fact that when a car goes into water, you don't know what happens to the engine. It was rumored that the engine was okay. The intakes on the Veyron are on the top. So when the car went into the water, it's very possible that the water didn't actually go into the engine. However, when salt water goes into the body of a car, it does a lot of damage. And it could have went into the seals. The salt air could have permeated through something. And it could have damaged some cylinder liners. Those cylinder liners, not very cheap. To do any sort of rebuild on that engine would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's not even that you just pay somebody that money and they'll get it done for you in a week. This is something that would take a year or more because those materials just don't exist. A lot of the stuff is aerospace technology. So you'd have to get somebody that lives on a top of a mountain and they're like soothsayers and only they can touch this car. So all the mechanical components for like the wing, that's all aerospace stuff that's made with specific grade aluminum, and the electronics, all that stuff is super bespoke. So this project would be just the mother of all projects. However, I still thought that we could sort of do it. And honestly, I've heard that the car was sold and somebody's willing to do that project, but I kind of think that in a few months it's going to be up for sale again, just because that's sketchy history and just because it's a bit more project than anybody's willing to take on, except for possibly Ed and I. When it got out that Ed and I were trying to do this and put this together, there's so many people that kind of messaged you just on the down low and say, hey, I have an interior for a Veyron, or hey, I have some body panels for a Veyron, and they were in good shape and they were in relatively okay price ranges. Again, relatively okay meaning $80,000 to $100,000, which is way more than I have. But for a Veyron, this was kind of standard fare. And you realize that there's sort of a black market for these cars. When they get Mansory treatments and they get all these carbon fiber body panels, or they do some sort of aftermarket stuff on the interior, the stock interior is still there. They don't throw it away. So whoever did the interior, that gets put on a shelf and then eventually sold because the owners forget about it. So that is kind of a cool takeaway. If you do end up owning a Veyron at some point, there are some parts available. Now, the problem is the parts available weren't exactly the parts that we needed. So wiring harness, not exactly available. So that would have to be done custom. All the radiators, probably not available. And engines, that's definitely not available. Nobody's replacing their engines. Nobody's doing an LS swap on their Veyron. So another thing that really concerned me is the fact that Veyron maintenance was a bit more expensive than your garden variety Honda Civic. If you just left a Veyron to sit for a few years, like this car had, then you'd be in it for tires, you'd be in it for wheels. Tires are about 25 grand. They're like these special Michelin Pax tires. You have to replace the wheels because the wheels, over time, they develop these little micro fissures, and you can't use them because that car is designed to go over 250 miles an hour. So just from that alone, that's about 80 grand. Then you have a $20,000 service. You take it to the dealer and they basically cut the car in half and they do all the things that they need to do. So that's $20,000, and that happens semi-regularly. So before you drive the car a mile, even if this car had been in perfect condition just sitting there, it's $100,000 just in maintenance. I mean, Ed and I had been talking about that for quite a long time, and he wanted to put miles on it. It's a car that he wanted to own, and he's exactly the kind of guy to own a haggard example of this, well, a haggard example of one of these cars, and just drive it around and even daily drive it, as crazy as that sounds. So it was pretty much the perfect car for both of us. Me, for the project aspect, I've never worked on something at such an elite level, and I never worked on such a challenge. This was like the Mount Everest of project cars. And Ed never had a car that was this high of dollar value, and also the story aspect of it really intrigued him. And it was definitely a one that got away because the money just didn't make any sense. If either of us were in better financial standing, I think we probably would have done it. But in, let's say, in 6 months, when that thing is for sale again by whoever bought it, because it's too much of a project for them, then we will revisit this, and hopefully in 2020 we'll have a nice Veyron to drive around.